The Twisted Lip Mystery. The inscrutable case of Hugh Boone. The year 1889 drew to a close with a cascade of fog and unseasonable rain, a climatic disposition that seemed to perfectly reflect the melancholy mood of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For weeks, the atmosphere in our chambers at 221B Baker Street had been one of stultifying calm, devoid of the stimulating intellectual friction upon which his genius thrived. He was in a state of self-imposed inertia, indulging in esoteric chemical experiments and the solitary contemplation of abstruse philosophical dilemmas. My own domestic circumstances, however, had undergone a profound and most welcome alteration. I had recently married, and my days were now devoted to the demanding, yet deeply rewarding, practice of medicine. I was momentarily residing in my own quarters, yet the irresistible magnetic pull of Holmes's work often drew me back to Baker Street. It was on a bleak morning, late in the week, that a sudden, urgent summons broke the monotony. My wife's friend, Mrs. St. Clair, arrived at my door in a state of profound distress, her composure utterly shattered by a domestic crisis of the most bewildering nature. The missing husband. Mrs. St. Clair's husband, Neville St. Clair, was a respectable, methodical, and financially secure gentleman, holding a senior position in the civil service. His daily routine was a model of punctilious regularity. His office was in the city, yet he occasionally indulged his eccentric curiosity by visiting an opium den in a notorious quarter of London known as the Bar of Gold. This single, admitted indiscretion was the key weakness in an otherwise impeccable character. The crisis had begun 2 nights prior. Mrs. St. Clair, having spent the day with a friend outside London, returned by an earlier train than expected. As her cab passed the very street where the opium den was located, she glanced up and saw, in the window of the first floor, the unmistakable face of her husband. However, he was not in his typical attire. He was leaning out, frantically waving his hands, an expression of sheer terror distorting his features. Before she could process the alarming sight, a rough-looking figure violently pulled him back inside. Mrs. St. Clair immediately demanded that her cab driver stop. She rushed into the squalid den, only to be confronted by a surly woman and the den's sole occupant, a horrifyingly deformed beggar known as Hugh Boone, notorious in the city for his repulsive appearance, particularly a severely twisted lip that gave him a permanent grimace. The police were summoned, and a search ensued. The room was thoroughly examined. They found no trace of Mr. Neville St. Clair. The only things discovered were some of his clothes, specifically, his fine morning coat, hidden behind a curtain, and an ominous bloodstain on the windowsill. The beggar, Hugh Boone, claimed absolute ignorance, asserting that Mr. St. Clair had left the premises some time before. Holmes's methodical inquiry. This was the conundrum laid before Holmes. A respectable gentleman vanishes into thin air, witnessed entering a den of vice, and leaves behind only his coat and a terrifying encounter with a deformed beggar. Holmes listened to the account with his customary impassivity, only interrupting once to inquire about the exact nature of the beggar's deformity and the bloodstain. His focus was immediately drawn to the concept of irreconcilable contradiction. "Watson," Holmes observed, tapping his long, lean fingers together, "we have here the most perplexing juxtaposition of identities. The meticulous, orderly civil servant, and the savage, disfigured denizen of the opium lair. One cannot simply vanish, the laws of physics are not suspended for domestic convenience. The man must either be dead, or the situation is far more nuanced than we are currently equipped to perceive. Our first visit was to the opium den. The scene was precisely as described, a smoky, fetid room, reeking of vice and despair. We were introduced to Hugh Boone, who sat sullenly, his face partially obscured by bandages covering his twisted lip. His demeanor was one of abject wretchedness, his answers to the police's questioning being vague and monosyllabic. Holmes, with an almost surgical detachment, observed every detail of the room, noting the position of the window, the nature of the bloodstain, which he swiftly determined to be minor, and, most significantly, a small, intricate leather box on the table. The deduction of the double life. That evening, back at Baker Street, the facts coalesced in Holmes's mind. "Watson," he announced, lighting his pipe, "the police's initial conclusion is based entirely on the assumption of a tragic death. The husband saw his wife, was recognized, struggled, and was killed by the beggar. This is a possibility, but it fails to account for one fundamental inconsistency: the beggar's complete lack of valuables or motive. Furthermore, Boone is too obvious a culprit, his very wretchedness serves as a distraction." Holmes then postulated a daring hypothesis, that Hugh Boone and Neville St. Clair were, in fact, the same man. "Consider the facts, Watson. We have a gentleman who occasionally visits a disreputable area for an illicit pleasure. This gentleman vanishes at the exact moment he is seen struggling with a hideous beggar, who then refuses to speak or cooperate, despite no evidence of a body. Now, examine the beggar. Hugh Boone is a man who earns a sizable income through professional begging, a trade often far more lucrative than a civil service position. The deformity is his stock in trade." Holmes pointed to the small box he had seen. "That box, I assure you, contains the implements of his disguise. The twisted lip is not a congenital defect, but a calculated application of makeup and prosthetics. The respectable Mr. St. Clair was living a clandestine double life as the infamous Hugh Boone. The King of Bohemia, with his elaborate disguise, was outwitted by Irene Adler, but here, the disguise was a matter of livelihood, not romance. The proof in the thumb." To prove this extraordinary assertion, Holmes had to obtain a clean, unmasked view of the beggar's face. He knew that any direct confrontation would fail, as the beggar would simply assume the persona of the civil servant and claim to be a victim of mistaken identity. Holmes arranged for a quiet, subtle observation of the beggar in police custody. He waited patiently for a moment of extreme fatigue or distraction. The opportunity arose early the following morning. Holmes and I visited the cell where Hugh Boone was being held. The beggar was sleeping soundly, his face partially turned towards the wall. Holmes, with meticulous care, applied a sponge soaked in strong ammonia to the beggar's face. The chemical sting was immediate and painful. Hugh Boone awoke with a sudden, pained cry, instinctively raising his hand to rub the irritant from his face. In that single, fleeting moment, as his hands tore away the false bandages and rubbed vigorously at his features, the thick layers of cosmetic grime and the prosthetic apparatus of the twisted lip were momentarily stripped away. We were staring, not at the monstrous Hugh Boone, but at the clean-cut, familiar face of Mr. Neville St. Clair. The transformation was chillingly complete. The man who had been the respectable civil servant now stood exposed, caught between his two identities. He was instantly subdued, the game being entirely up. The revelation of motive. Mr. St. Clair subsequently made a full confession. Years ago, having fallen into financial difficulties, he discovered that begging, particularly when utilizing a convincing and repulsive disguise, was enormously profitable. He found the act deeply humiliating, yet the financial rewards were substantial enough to sustain his respectable, middle-class life and provide comfort for his wife and family. He would disappear for a few days at a time, claiming business trips, only to emerge in his alter ego, Hugh Boone. He would return home wealthy, his wife none the wiser about the true source of their income. The disastrous incident occurred when his wife saw him through the window. He was so terrified of being seen by his respectable identity that his natural reaction was to struggle to escape the window, not the room. The figure who pulled him back inside was merely the den's assistant, helping the panicked beggar. The bloodstain was caused when Mr. St. Clair cut himself on the window catch during his desperate scramble. The missing coat was simply part of the costume change, discarded quickly in his panic. Conclusion: the paradox of respectability. The case closed not with a murder, but with a complex moral and legal paradox. The police faced the unusual dilemma of prosecuting a man for maintaining a professional disguise and misleading the authorities, rather than for a serious crime. The legal outcome was ambiguous, complicated by the fact that he had not technically committed fraud against an individual, only against society's expectation of respectability. The greatest crimes, Watson, Holmes mused, as we returned to the familiar comfort of Baker Street, are often nothing more than the profound contradictions inherent in human nature. This man sought wealth to sustain a life of reputation, but the very act of acquiring that wealth destroyed the reputation he sought to uphold. He found in squalor a greater financial reward than in probity. He then added, with a rare, dry smile, "It is a testament to the singular complexity of London, where one can truly be two entirely different men in the space of a single street." The ultimate mystery was not where the man went, but why he felt compelled to create two such irreconcilable lives.
Final thoughts and your challenge. The ultimate paradox of this case lies in a single question. What moral obligation truly drove Neville St. Clair, his reputation or his family's comfort? Join the conversation. Leave a comment below explaining your perspective on St. Clair's dilemma. Use at least one C1 level word from the story in your analysis. Ready for the next enigma? Don't break your momentum. Subscribe to English Story Source for more advanced mysteries and masterpieces every day.